I'm Bob Kieve. I was born in Jersey City, New Jersey. I'm told that I was born on a metal table in the kitchen. I survived that, and my mother apparently did too. We were a family that moved around in northern New Jersey, Union City, Jersey City, and I went to Woodrow Wilson High School, where I distinguished myself by doing nothing very well. And it was very obvious to my father that something had to be done with his son. Because he knew what the problem was. The problem was that the son had a girlfriend. If you can imagine a 12-year-old boy having a girlfriend. And he scraped together all the money he could and sent me off to a prep school in Massachusetts, which was very important because from the day I arrived there, I was really a different person. For one thing, the girl was not with me, but I started getting very good grades, started getting very active in non-academic activities, such as the newspaper. I became editor of the high school newspaper, and a few other things I did that were much better than I had been doing anything at Woodrow Wilson High School. And as a result of all that, I managed to get into Harvard, which I certainly had never thought would be possible. But that was possible, and it did happen. And you know, at Harvard, I didn't distinguish myself either. I got lousy grades. But there was an excuse for it, and that was that toward the end of my freshman year, toward the end of the first quarter of the freshman year, the Harvard Crimson, which was the newspaper, started a radio station. And I started working on it. And I spent really 8 hours a day on that radio station. The result was that I didn't spend very much time on my studies, but managed to slip through. And by the time I was a junior, I was actually running that radio station and knew that I wanted to make radio my career. The war was on. I arrived at Harvard in September of 1939, and the war was raging, and I finally graduated from Harvard, and one fine day, I remember a young physician hovering over me, using his cold stethoscope on my chest, and all of a sudden stopping and listening and listening. I was wondering what was happening, little realizing that that was really a turning point in my life, because the young physician went out of the room, and when he came back, he had with him an older physician who then took his cold stethoscope and put it on my chest and turned to the young physician and said, "Congratulations, this was a very difficult thing for you to hear, but you heard it, And you were right, he has a heart murmur. So the result of that was that the armed forces didn't want anything to do with me, which I would like to be able to say broke my heart, but it didn't. And I immediately after graduating saw what I could do about the war effort, and I had learned that, I hadn't yet learned it. One of the areas that I thought I might be helpful in was the Office of War Information, which was the propaganda arm of the State Department. And I applied and was accepted. And at that time, I knew that there was an opening in London for people who could speak German. And actually, I failed to say to you that my first language was German. And they wanted people also who had some experience in radio, which to some extent I had had. So I was expecting to be sent to London to do our propaganda work there. But the people doing the hiring at that time, the recruiters, I don't think did a very good job. They sent me to Spain, a country whose language I knew absolutely nothing about. I could not even count to 10. And they gave me a job that I was really very unsuited for. They gave me a piece of equipment that looked like a typewriter, but was really an encoding and outcoding piece of equipment. I had to learn how to take it apart and put it back together again, because in the outpost in Madrid I wasn't going to have any help at all. But I managed, and I arrived in Madrid in August of 1943, few short weeks after graduating from college, and I got to work on coding. I was a terrible code clerk. They called me, what'd they call me? Oh, I can't remember. There's a word, garble Kieve, which meant that I was not doing a very good job. But I did it, and it got done for about a year. My boss was a young man, actually only 1 year older than I. And we became pretty good friends. He was the head of the propaganda outfit in Madrid. And he thought maybe I was being wasted. I thought I was too, with that damned, it was called a Hageline machine. And I kept on working on that at night. And he suggested that I might, during the daytime, do something about one department of the Office of War Information in Madrid, which was filled with, I think, 6 translators. And these translators received from the United States stuff that the people in the United States thought was propaganda. And it wasn't. It was a lot of pictures and a lot of feature stuff. But my boss, whose name incidentally was Emmett Hughes, recognized that probably nothing was being done. These pieces that were being sent from the United States were being translated, and then by the translators themselves were being sent to media, chiefly newspapers throughout Spain and magazines throughout Spain. And he wanted me to do something that would maybe have some impact. And I realized that what we were getting from the United States was kind of worthless. So I started writing stuff myself. I set myself up as a military analyst, which was some nerve. But what I was doing was knowing what the instructions from headquarters in Washington were on the subject of how we were winning the war. And so that was the subject that I pushed. All of a sudden, we started getting placement in newspapers throughout Spain where we hadn't had them up to that time. Now that was, I can tell you, because of my brilliance. But it wasn't. It had something to do with a man named Eisenhower, who was leading forces first in North Africa, then in Sicily, then in the boot of Italy, and was all by himself, without any propaganda, making it clear that we were winning the war. And the result of that was that the censorship under Francisco Franco, which had been very, very stiff, suddenly loosened up and made it possible for me to get my stuff in all these newspapers and magazines. But I wasn't satisfied with what I was doing. I wanted to do something else. The something else was radio, as I had done it in college. And I asked Emmett Hughes, young man who knew everybody in Madrid, if he could introduce me to somebody at Radio Madrid. And he did. He introduced me to a young man named Manuel Aznar. This is a picture I'm looking at now, but I suppose you can't point the camera there at any. It's right up there. Okay. Manolo Aznar was the program director of Radio Madrid, and since Radio Madrid was the key station in the Spanish privately owned network called SER, S-E-R, all of his stuff was going throughout Spain. But I was the one-eyed man in the country of the blind, because Manolo didn't know anything about radio. Nobody else did. They'd been busy fighting a civil war. And here I was, the one-eyed man in the country of the blind. I had run a college radio station for whatever that was worth, and I had done a lot of reading. And so I knew a lot about radio that Manolo Aznar wanted to learn. And so we became very fast friends. And one day we were discussing one of the programs on Radio Madrid, and he said something that I'd been waiting for him to say, which was, well, Kieve, why don't you put together a show on Radio Madrid? And I did. I wrote it. I had the translators translate it. It was on the subject of oh yes, it was on the subject of our landings in the Philippines with General MacArthur. And the first thing I asked was, how many people can I use? Oh, we have a corps of actors, said Manolo. You can use them all. So I said, fine. I wrote the script. I had the translators translate it.
Drama.
drama, yes, dramatizing the landings, and we put it on. But just before we put it on, Manolo said to me, Bob, or Bob, as he used to call me, would you like to be in the studio or the control room when we broadcast this? I said, oh yeah, sure. So I was, and when the program ended, Manolo turned to me and said, well, what did you think? And I said, it was a disaster. He said, really? I said, well, of course it was a disaster. Let me ask you a question. How many hours did they rehearse? Rehearse? We don't rehearse. We just give the actors a copy of the script, tell them to study it, and then we go and do it. And I said, well, that's interesting. He said, well, Kieve, you're so unhappy, why don't you do another one? I said, I will, but how about rehearsal? He said, you call the shots. And so we did. And I did create a new show. I think it was on the subject of a man named Stettinius. Stettinius was the new Secretary of State. And I wrote that, and we rehearsed the hell out of it. And when it was finished, everybody decided, by golly, this rehearsal stuff, that really works out pretty well. And so from that time on, we did rehearse. And I pretty soon was doing about a show a week. And among other things, one of the translators, it turned out, was a poet who, in the political climate of Spain at that time, simply was not able to get a job. And one fine day, in a gesture that really brings tears to my eyes, he gave me a sheaf of papers and said, I know you're busy. That was what he was like. I know you're busy, but when you get a chance, could you look at this? I said, sure. And I started looking at it, and it was wonderful. It was a script about the Mississippi River and its role in the American war effort. And we put it on with rehearsal, and it had a real wonderful effect. The listeners really liked it. The actors liked it very much. So from that point on, there was no question about rehearsal. There was no question about what we would do. And so in a very real sense, it sounds terrible to say this, but others have said it, radio in Spain was revolutionized. And one fine day, by this time we had a second program on. One of our translators was an unemployed physician, so he did a 15-minute show on medicine in the United States. And we learned that one of the objectives of our propaganda that Washington wanted us to pursue was to demonstrate that the United States really had some culture, because the folks in Madrid and Europe thought that all culture resided on the European continent. We did quite a few other things of that kind. I want to tell you one little story, though, that I think you'll find fun. I put myself in one of the shows. There were two people, one of them named Pedro and the other Pablo, and I was Pedro. And we ended each one of those programs with the same words. Pablo would say, "Oh, I'm not so sure of that, Pedro." Of course, in Spanish. And that was how each of our shows ended. It turned out that there was a movie in Spain at that time, and somewhere in the movie, one of the characters said to the other, "Oh, I'm not so sure of that." "No estoy tan seguro de eso, Pedro." The audience, as if one person came in and said, "Pedro," which suggested that we were getting some listening on our own stuff. I finally left Spain. I must say that they were so kind. They offered me a job to reorganize the network that they had, which was weird, that they should have determined that a 24-year-old kid should be given that responsibility. But about that time, it was suggested to me that maybe I should write a book on the subject of broadcasting, and the book should be leveled at getting young people interested in it as a way of making their living. And so I did a series of lectures called Your Career is Radio. One of them on how to write scripts, another one on how to be an actor, another one on how to direct the scripts, so forth. And that worked out pretty well, because from that there were members of the audience who sent me scripts, and I would put them on. And so we had a series going called Your Career is Radio. And from that, somebody suggested that I write a book on that subject. And I did. And that book is, I think I showed it to you. That book talked about how to do radio in its various forms. And the Spanish story, I have just one more thing to tell you about it, and that is about 4 years later, I got a message from one of my friends in Spain. We had become very good friends, and he said, "You know, our government has just done something that gives me a real problem. Our government has said that any radio station, any owners of radio stations who are broadcasting on the AM dial need to create another radio station, an FM station." And my friend said, "I don't know what the hell to do about it. What am I going to do with an FM station?" Well, about that time, something that you know was going big throughout the United States, Top 40. So I described Top 40 to him. He asked me to come to Spain again to help put it in. And Radio Madrid, which had been kind of a talk show up to that point, was now a top 40 radio station. And as happened in the United States, Top 40 ran away with it, and all of a sudden Radio Madrid was just far ahead of every other station. So that, I don't suppose this is true anymore, because that was 30, 40 years ago. But for a while, I was spoken of as the father of Top 40 in Madrid.
What about Eisenhower? We skipped over Eisenhower.
No, we didn't.
You're better this than I am.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah,
All right.
yeah.
Father of Top 40.
Yeah. Now, all this time, it became increasingly easy for us to tell the story of what the Allies were doing against the Germans and the Italians. It became increasingly easy because Eisenhower was doing it. And as a result, all of a sudden, the very strict censorship that we had was being loosened. And we were suddenly able to do whatever we wanted by way of propaganda in Madrid.
You wrote speeches for Eisenhower?
Oh, that came later.
Oh, okay. All right.
I just wondered what you wanted me to segue into, but you just told me. So I came back to the. I did not take them up on their wonderful offer to allow me to reorganize their network, which I would have done a very poor job of, and I went back to the United States, and it was interesting. I thought I had done a pretty smashing job in Spain, and I thought maybe somebody would recognize it and give me a job in the United States, but nobody did. So finally I had to take a job in upstate New York, Geneva, New York, population 20,000, and I worked there for 2 wonderful years. I had all kinds of fun as a program director. I did play-by-play basketball, high school basketball, play-by-play Class C or maybe D or E baseball, and I was very happy doing that. But there finally came a time when I realized I was going nowhere in a very nice town of 20,000 population, and that I should maybe get back to the United States. And so I did. And once again, when I was there, I say once again, when I was there and when I arrived this time from Geneva, New York, with what I thought was a pretty good record, nobody gave a damn about that either. And so I didn't get a job for 3-4 months. And then in one day, boom, I got 3 offers, any one of which I would have taken. One was with CBS, writing promotional material. The other one was nighttime administrator of yeah.
You're so close to the microphone that it's probably not picking up.
Yeah, probably not. The second one was nighttime administrator of the Mutual Broadcasting System. And the third one was program director of WNYC in New York. I should have taken that job. Instead, I went to CBS and did some dumb writing of promotional material. But about that time, there was some real activity politically involving Dwight Eisenhower. And my friend Emmett Hughes, who had been my helpful boss in Spain, was selected by Henry Luce to save what it was considered to be the problem of the Eisenhower campaign in 1952. And they called on him to become the chief speechwriter. And he did a wonderful job. And they insisted that he join them in Washington, which he did not want to do, but he did. And they told him that he needed an assistant. And he said he didn't need an assistant, but they insisted. So, since Emmett and I were friends, I became the assistant and was able to work in the White House on speeches. My friends like to say that I was a speechwriter for President Eisenhower, and that is a designation that really is much too fancy. I was the guy. I had another job which was much more important. I was the guy who drafted letters of congratulations to people celebrating their 50th wedding anniversaries. That was my job. And I did it all day long and all night long. I got involved in the speeches too, but that was my big contribution, my daily contribution to the speechwriting group of in the Eisenhower White House.
You must have some thoughts about politics today.
Oh yeah. Wouldn't it be difficult not to?
What the environment would be like.
Huh?
What the environment today would be like compared to Eisenhower.
Well, it was as different as it could be. I mean, we had a highly moral man in the White House who it really killed him to have to lie, and he did one. You remember when a man named Powers had an airplane that flew over, and they shot it down, and Eisenhower had to say that it really wasn't I don't know, that he knew nothing about it or something of that kind, and then soon thereafter had to admit the terrible truth that our spying effort had been discovered. I cannot see today's president making a confession of that kind. Eisenhower was a highly moral person. So,
What did you learn from being in the White House, in that environment?
what did I?
What did you take out of that that you might apply later in life that you learned from being in politics?
I don't think I should do that off the... I knew that I was deeply devoted to the man, as were all other members of the staff. I knew that he was a wonderful human being. I also knew, to my surprise, that he was a professor of English language. He was not thought of that way in those days, because in his press conferences he sometimes stumbled, sometimes wasn't very articulate. But I can tell you that he edited everything I wrote and improved it. He was a really first-class editor. It was amazing. It was so different from what he was being painted as, namely a very nice guy who really didn't have much interest in finer things like the English language. But
Who played golf.
And who played golf. Yeah. So that this revelation was very interesting to me. There was something else that was interesting to me that, I don't know whether you have time for this, but, well,
All the time in the world.
before I went to Spain, I knew nothing about it. As I've told you, including the Spanish language, knew nothing about it. I didn't know anything about the foreign policy except the basics, namely that Spain had gone through a terrible civil war, that the Russians were on one side in helping them, and the Italians and the Germans were on the other side. There was a newspaper in Spain, New York at that time, forgotten the name of it, but it was a paper that was very liberal and took up the line of other liberals in that time, in that period, that the United States should not be bothering with Spain, or that if we were to bother with it, it should be to attack Spain, because Spain was on the side of the Axis. And as the result, this newspaper, which many of us read, determined that we should get rid of our ambassador in Spain. The ambassador's name was Carlton J.H. Hayes. He was a historian. He had written the books that I read both in high school and in college. He also happened to be very close to my friend Emmett Hughes. And it was he, Ambassador Hayes, who pulled Hughes from Columbia University, which he was at that time, and made him head of the propaganda effort. The campaign against Carlton Hayes was one that was really very, very unfair. And you asked me, did I learn something when I was in Spain? Yes. I learned that an ambassador does not make policy. They were blaming everything we did on Ambassador Hayes, but Hayes had nothing to do with it. In this case, as a matter of fact, it wasn't even the State Department that was setting the policy. The policy, our policy towards Spain, was being created by the Pentagon. And the purpose was to see to it that Hitler did not have his way. His way would have been, he was at the Pyrenees already, to drive down through Spain, take Gibraltar, and in taking Gibraltar to stymie totally the efforts of the United States and the British in their activities in the Mediterranean. Well, during World War II, their radio was devoted, as were so many other activities, to the war effort. And there were some wonderful programs, dramatizations that were written and produced by the networks during that time. Since I wasn't in the country, I don't know what the local stations did. My guess is that they were just beginning to play music on these 16-inch discs.
Yeah.
And And when they weren't connected to a network, which of course was something they all wanted to be, why they were playing music off those 16 inchers. There was always, or almost always, news on the hour, generally about 5 minutes. And you know what the format of the Top 40 was, because you lived through it.
Yeah, 2020 news.
Yeah.
That's for sure. Well, when is Empire Broadcasting started?
Well, okay. I'll go back very quickly. At the end of Eisenhower's first term, there was a reshuffling of the staff. My boss, who by this time was no longer Emmett Hughes, was leaving. And so I was leaving. And I was, at that time, I really should have told this in another way. Let me go back to the time when I left WGVA in Geneva, New York, to go to New York City. And I said to my boss at that time, the owner of the station, I've enjoyed this very much. This has been a great experience. I'm so happy, but I really have to leave. Because although you obviously are not aware of it, radio is dead. Radio is being eaten alive by this thing that's already up in Rochester, a few miles away. It's called television, and it's going to kill radio. And he said to me, well, that's very interesting. And he patted me on my already balding head. And he said, you're wrong. And furthermore, I can predict that someday, in the not too distant future, you will once again be working for me in radio. And I said, that's very kind of you, but that ain't going to happen. And so that's when I went to New York, got involved with CBS in radio and television. And now we end the 4 years at the White House, and I was without a job. I wasn't too scared about it, but I didn't have a job. I got a telephone call from my boss in Geneva, New York. He said, this is a memory test. Do you happen to remember something I said to you when you left here? Yeah, I do. He said, well, I'll tell you what's happened. You told me to sell this radio station. I didn't do it. With its profits, I bought another one in Utica. And with the profits of the two of them, today I bought a station here in Rochester. How would you like to come up and run it for me? So he had won his big bet. And so I went to Rochester, and we converted that station from playing music that the disc jockeys wanted to play to the music that had been researched and was top 40. And the man who was doing that for us, acting as a consultant, predicted that we would be number one the very next time that the Hooper ratings came out. He was absolutely right. We were a big number one. And we stayed that way for many years. I stayed up there for 10 years. And then my friend sold his radio station. And I went out and raised money to buy a new station somewhere, anywhere. It turned out to be this one here in San Jose, KLIV, which was already doing very well as a top 40 station. And so that's how I got out here. And within I think 4 or 5 years, we bought another station. This was an FM station. We called it KRTY in Santa Clara. And that station really took off. Then a few years after that, we bought a pair of very weak stations in a community called Auburn, California. And we converted one of them to top 40, to the KRTY format. And that went very well. And then we got a little cocky, and we bought a station in Oregon. It had a poor signal. It was a daytimer only. But we were so cocky that we thought if we took the KRTY format and put it on that station, we'd have the same results we'd had here. We didn't. For one thing, before we actually landed in Oregon, I can't remember the name of the city. See, you wouldn't blame me. Somebody else decided to do something similar to the KRTY format. And for weeks, we did nothing but lose money. We finally got rid of the station. We gave it away. And then the next move that we made was with what is now KRTY. It was a station, a very weak station in Los Gatos. And so now we had KRTY, KLIV, and KRTY in Santa Clara. We didn't want to sell anything. We were having a great time. But somebody came along and made a stupid offer. And I remember that my close friend and associate, Vincent Lopopolo, and I looked at that offer and couldn't believe it. And I said, I don't want to sell this station. And he said, neither do I. But what are you going to do about it? I said, well, I'm going to put it in my files and bring it up at the next board of directors meeting. But he said, that's 6 weeks off. You can't do that. He was right. I couldn't do it. So we sold it for the crazy amount of money that these people wanted to have. And then, instead of continuing where we had left off, they changed it to Mexican music, and everything fell apart. But we were in good shape. And that really is it. We've continued that way. KLIV has gone through a real series of changes, different rock music, and then finally the music of your life, which was the name given to music of Benny Goodman and Glenn who? Glenn Miller, yes, and that bunch, and finally, nothing was going well. We settled on news, not because we thought it would work financially, but because we liked the idea. And It did pretty well, but it lost money. And finally we had to change that. And here we are today with KLIV off the air. And we hope that we'll be able to do something interesting when we put KLIV back on the air.
We changed "I am delighted" to "I am gratified." It is gratifying to know.
So we had a funny little thing that, if it's possible for me to say that I had a funny little thing with the President of the United States. I used to get calls from his secretary saying, Bob, the President changed your such and such to read as such and such. I'll send it up to you, but I think you want to have a look at it. And she did that because every time the President edited something of mine, she had to retype it. That was the days before computers. And so all of these, she had to, these are all mine, she had to redo them. And one fine day, she said to me, Bob, are you aware of the fact that you use the word appreciation a lot? I said, yeah, I do, because the stuff I'm writing is generally the President thanking people for things that they've done, and even thanking those who have achieved 50 years of marital bliss. And she said, well, so you are aware that you use that word, appreciation? Yes. Are you also aware of the fact that you follow it invariably with the word for? Yes, and I am aware of that. And are you aware also of the fact that invariably the President crosses off for and puts in the word of, so that instead of it being appreciation for, it's appreciation of? Yes, Ann, I said, I am aware of that. Didn't want to say anything about it. But you know, and then I heard myself saying, the President is wrong. Appreciation for is gratitude. Appreciation of is understanding. And what I write is gratitude. There was a silence on the other side of the phone. She came back and she said, Bob, I've been looking at the President's schedule. He has an opening at 4 o'clock this afternoon. Would you like to explain that all to him? So I didn't.